Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Before I begin, I just want to talk on a personal note. I was in and out of the Army before Vietnam started. I was in the 1st Infantry Division, and about 6 months after I got out of the Army, they went to Vietnam. I lost friends from the Army in Vietnam, killed and wounded. Classmates from Boston College, killed and wounded. And then another set of friends who were so damaged by their participation in the war, they never reached their potential. And 3 in particular died in their 50s. And so, as a result of that and my experiences in Russia and Ukraine, this war should end and end now. It is all the poor who are dying and the elderly. Anyone in both countries of any means are long gone or well protected. They're not certainly being exposed to all the tragedy that we see every day. So let's begin. My own involvement with Russia began in 1986. I was in the book publishing business, still am as a matter of fact, there was a young man, Soviet diplomat, appearing before Congress, and he was explaining Chernobyl, the place in Ukraine, the nuclear reactor blew up. And so in his bio it said he lived in Washington for 5 years, spoke perfect English. So I got the idea, how about him writing a book comparing living in Washington to Moscow? So I called him up. And I'll never forget his opening to me was, "Who are you, what do you want?" And so I told him, and he says, I would love to do something like that, but I don't have that kind of authority. If you could call me tomorrow, he said, I'll see if I can get authority. So I called him the next day, and he said, I have authority. We talked about a contract, came to an agreement pretty quickly. And so he said, why don't you come down to Washington, we'll sign the contract, talk about the book. So down I went with my wife. We had a meeting with him at the embassy at 9 o'clock the following morning. So I said to my wife, would you like to come with me over to the Soviet embassy? And she said, I wouldn't go near that place. I said, well, I'm going over. So over I went. And the embassy at the time was the former Pullman railroad car estate, right near the White House. We sat up in the ballroom, which was all golden and mirrors, a beautiful room. We sat there for 2 hours, signed the contract, talked about the book, but then kind of hit it off as 2 relative young men. So at the end of the 2 hours, I said to him, I told him the story about my wife who was afraid to come. And he said, why don't you go get her, and I'll give her a private tour of this beautiful building. So I went back and I got my wife. And as we approached the embassy, he was standing on the steps and he said, Mary, come on in. There's nothing to be afraid of. So that night, that's Vitaly Churkin and his wife, Irina. My wife took the picture. We went to dinner celebrating the book, the signing of the contract. So he started writing the book. And about 3 months into it, he called me one day and he said, I can't explain anything, but I've been ordered back to Moscow. And when I get a chance, I'll call you. And of course, I'm thinking, I'll never hear from him again. But sure enough, 3 months go by and he called me again and he said, I can't talk about this on the telephone, but there's a ticket for you at the embassy. Come over, we'll see what we're going to do about the book. So I went over. And he was one of the planners of Perestroika, so his days were full. He didn't have much time for writing a book. But he told me about all the changes were going to happen over there business-wise, and he introduced me to a publishing group, which I joined. We published the first telephone book in Moscow since 1930. But he also said to me, I'm very nervous about what's going to happen here. So he said, if the government collapses, I want my children educated in the West, so I'm going to become an ambassador. And sure enough, when the Soviet Union collapsed, he became an ambassador to Chile. From there, he went on to be ambassador to NATO, to Belgium, to Canada. And in the year 2000, Putin appointed him the UN ambassador to the UN. Over the years, the book never got written. Over the years, we would meet in Moscow, New York, Washington, London, one time in Atlanta. And we were just, all our conversations really were about family and travel. Our last meeting was in August of 2016. We had dinner in New York, Mary and I, Vitaly. And the conversation was just like they always were. But I said to him, what do you think of Trump? And he said, you know, I don't know anything about him. But he said, I had lunch today with some serious Trump supporters who tell me some emails are going to come out about Hillary. And that's all I know. And we continued on with the dinner. And unfortunately, about 2 months later, he died at his desk, a heart attack. The problem was many Russian male, heavy drinking, rich diet, no exercise. I later got interviewed by the FBI about that comment, and they told me that they had him under surveillance, and so that they would find out who those two people were. It was not my only meeting with the FBI. Right from the beginning, the first time I went into the embassy, I got a visit from the FBI and said, what are you doing going into the embassy of the Soviet Union? And I told them. They said, can you prove it? And I said, sure, here's a contract. So that started many interviews with the FBI over my career. There's the picture of us after the dinner, a few more gray hairs, a little more weight. There he is with Putin and Lavrov. I was interviewed by the Pentagon as the possible successor to Putin. And my friend Vitaly was identified as one of three. But he was the only one oriented towards the West. All the other two were oriented towards the East, or in other words, China. So my own involvement, I made 60 trips back and forth. I lived in Moscow. I saw communism collapse overnight without any bloodshed. And I think history will go down and record that as really unbelievable that it disappeared. I saw confirmed communists on Sunday become confirmed capitalists on Monday morning. It was truly extraordinary. I had two very big highlights really of my time in Soviet Union and Russia. One was I was asked by President George Herbert Walker Bush to arrange, as part of a summit with President Gorbachev, the erection of the statues, Make Way for Ducklings in Moscow, and the printing of the book in Russian in Moscow. The other one was a tour of Soviet space with Wally Schirra. Wally was one of our original astronauts, and I published his book about his life in space. And so he came over to officiate at the opening of an organization I was involved in. And when the Russians heard he was coming, they asked if Wally would go out to Kyrgyzia to a secret space research institute they had there to look at technologies that they wanted to sell NASA because they were broke. And Wally and I went out. One of the things that Wally discovered while he was out there was they were way behind us in the space race. And the other one, to show you what the competition was like, there was a cosmonaut with us. So Wally said to the cosmonaut, you know, you can clear up a big mystery for the American space program. You set up Gagarin, we set up Shepard. You set up 2, we set up 2. Then, by God, you set up 3, and we're saying, how the hell do they fit 3 cosmonauts in that spaceship? And he said, the cosmonaut put a big smile on his face and his Wally. We go back to Moscow. I will show you the spaceship. And so we went back to Moscow. I didn't go on that out to Star City, but that night at dinner, Wally said, this is absolutely unbelievable. To drive the Americans nuts, and they did. They took out the seats and put in a bench. Got the 3 astronauts into the spaceship. So Here are the ducklings in Moscow, exact duplicate of what's in Boston. The sculptress Nancy Schromm made a duplicate set, took them over to Moscow. And there's the book. Only printed about 100 copies. If you go to Moscow and you go to the park where the statues are, it's another proof to me that people are people, because what are you going to see? You're going to see the exact same thing you see in Boston. You're going to see young families with the children sitting on the ducks and the parents taking the pictures. So Vladimir Putin. He is a very intriguing, I describe him as competent, corrupt, and a psychopath. Grew up in Leningrad, was admitted to the top high school in the Soviet Union by exam. I was given this talk in Lexington. A man stood up and he said, "I don't have a question for you," but he said, "I can add something." He said, "I grew up with Putin in the same neighborhood at the same time." And he said, "I can tell you, he is a street thug. He was always getting in street fights. As a matter of fact," he said, sometimes he went looking for them. So he has a very unusual combination of being very, very bright and being basically a street thug. And so then he went to Leningrad University. When he graduated, he joined the KGB, and his first assignment was Dresden, Germany. What's significant about that is only the most trusted KGB officers were sent to Germany because they would be exposed to Western television from West Berlin. When communism collapsed and the wall came down, he then moved to St. Petersburg as an assistant to the mayor, who was destined to be the first president of Russia, but he fell victim to a scandal, so his star fell. Then Putin was moved to Moscow to be an assistant to Yeltsin. It's hard for me to explain the chaos that existed under Boris Yeltsin. The whole system of government, communism, had collapsed. It was kind of a free-for-all. Millions of people lost their jobs, their prestige. One of the byproducts of that was, for the first time in history, the average age of a Russian male went from 68 to 57. Never in recorded history has there been such a drop. And the basic reasons were because of all the loss of status, loss of job, loss of income. There was rampant depression and a huge increase in alcoholism. So that was the main driver of the death rate going down to 57. It was not uncommon during that period to see dead bodies on the street, victims of mafia wars. It was not uncommon to go to the metro when your metro card was canceled. There'd be a line of about a mile long to get another one. Or go to the bank, you have a bundle of 100 ruble notes canceled. So it was that kind of chaos. So Yeltsin appointed Putin the head of the KGB, then the head of the national security, and finally the prime minister. When he was prime minister, he negotiated Yeltsin's retirement with an agreement of immunity for him and his family, because the corruption that we're seeing today in Russia, mostly the oligarchs, they started all their fortunes under Yeltsin. So here's a timeline, and as we all know, he's now president, and he virtually can be president for life if he wants. But he is popular. In spite of what you may read in the Western press, he's popular. it is not endless popularity. Things are not going well with the Russian people. I still talk to people in Moscow. Life is not as it was, and major changes. And again, we're seeing depression and alcoholism because of it. But the reason he is popular is that he restored the Russian pride. He removed all of that chaos from the Yeltsin's part. But more importantly, he brought in, particularly for women, labor-saving devices that did not have under the Soviet system. There were no washing machines, no dryers, no dishwashers, no small appliances. So he enabled all of that to come in, and that's one of the reasons there was some organization and life got better for the Russian people. He has proven that corruption and competence can coexist in one person. One of the few autocrats in history that's able to do that, and I'll give you more. He controls the press. Up until the Ukraine war, the press was pretty free. There's a professor at, I heard a talk from Brandeis, who lives in Moscow and commutes back and forth every 3 months. And he was given a talk, and he said, you know, the days of the big bad black bear are over. I can say whatever I want, I can start a business. Well, today you can't say everything you want. So he's clamped down again, and the press he controls. A main factor in his popularity is the Russian Orthodox Church. They have been behind him from the very beginning. And this will give you an idea. This is a military cathedral that was just...
A new cathedral outside Moscow, dedicated to the Russian armed forces, has been consecrated. The ceremony on Sunday was attended by the country's top military brass, and soldiers were in World War II era uniforms. The opening was originally planned for May the 9th, the 75th anniversary of Victory Day, but was postponed due to the coronavirus pandemic. The consecration was led by Russia's Orthodox Patriarch, Kirill. The invited audience included many decorated military veterans. Today, as a unified people in this military cathedral, we remember the feats of our soldiers and we pray for our fatherland, so that the Lord protects our country from external and internal enemies. The dignitaries included Defense Minister Shoigu and Vasily Gerasimov, the Chief of the General Staff. There had been plans to install mosaics of President Vladimir Putin and former Soviet leader Joseph Stalin in the cathedral, but the idea was dropped after a public outcry. The Soviet Union lost an estimated 26 million people during World War II, including 8.5 million soldiers, and remembrance of victory has become fundamental to Russian identity.
So the whole idea that they want to put a mosaic of Putin in the wall shows you how close he is to the Russian Orthodox Church. To put in perspective the 8.5 million soldiers that Russia lost, the Soviet Union lost in World War II, we lost 460,000. One of the reasons I never thought Putin would invade Ukraine was, I remember vividly being at a cocktail party in 1988 in Moscow, and a woman said, I want to make a toast to peace. And she said, I never want anyone to experience what I experienced. She said, I was 10 years old living in a village in the south of Russia when the Nazi army came through. And she said, my mother and I hid in the basement. We weren't discovered. The next day we go out onto the street in the village the army had passed on. And she said, I saw my classmates, 10 years old, hanging from trees. So those kinds of horror stories I heard from almost every family I encountered, which was one of the reasons I never thought that this war would happen. But it is happening, and Putin has done this before. Let me give you an example. So here is Chechnya. Chechnya is a republic in the south of Russia, 100% Muslim. In World War II, Stalin moved the entire population to Siberia because he was afraid that they would join the Nazi army. After the war, he brought them back. But they were always a thorn in the side of Moscow. There were major players in the world, the underworld of the Soviet Union and Russia, members of the mafia. They were very resistant to authority. And so they fought with Yeltsin. Yeltsin sent the army down, but the terrorists and the members of the rebels in Chechnya fought the Soviet army to a standstill. And so they signed a peace agreement, which gave the Chechens almost autonomy, and this outraged the people of Russia. They then, when Putin became prime minister, did two things. They blew up an apartment building in Moscow as an act of terror, and they took 300 children hostage to trade for Chechens who were in Russian prisons. Putin sent the army in to rescue the children, but over 100 children were killed. At that point, Putin said, I will go down to Chechnya and settle this. He sent the army and the air force, and he leveled the capital city of Grozny. This is what it looks like. These are Russian citizens, and he killed 160,000 of them. But after it was over, he said, I'll rebuild. And he totally defeated the rebel army, and he rebuilt the city. In the foreground, he built the biggest mosque in Europe, and large buildings all around it. It's another picture. Sports stadiums, he built the whole place. So I'd like to say recent Russian history is best displayed by this department store. This is GUM, the major department store in Russia. Sits on Red Square. When you see the newsreels of the marching on Red Square, it's right next to this. So built in about 1870. There it is lit up at night. So here's it under the Soviet days. Now if you look, you see a lot of women with bags, and they're sitting down, they all look pretty tired. This is the result of what I mentioned. It was left to the women, the grandmothers really, and some grandfathers, to do the shopping every day, because it was mandatory for men and women under 50 to work. And often, since they didn't have supermarkets, they would have to go to 4 or 5 shops to get food for the evening meal. And then on top of that, many times there were shortages, so they'd have to go across town or different neighborhoods to find the food. So you can see these ladies sitting down, and they look pretty tired. After communism collapsed, it became an emporium for every luxury brand in the world. Dior, Apple, all of them, they were in here. This is what it is today. All the Western brands closed up and left Russia, and it's virtually empty. So here is Ukraine tucked in under Russia, and then there's Central Europe, Romania, Czechoslovakia, those countries, and then you get to Western Europe. A little bit of history. Russia started in Kiev. The original Russia was Rus, and it moved on from there. One of the problems we're having, I think in America, is we don't get much very accurate news. There's a lot of cheerleading for Ukraine for obvious reasons, but it's not accurate information. Ukraine has not released any numbers of killed or wounded or anything like that, and they're very effective with Zelensky parading on TV and making all kinds of statements, but most of the information is not accurate. But there are 2 sites I've used to get basically correct or accurate information. The first is a think tank in Washington, populated by General Petraeus and some other military people. And the other one, the South Front, is a consortium of journalists from Europe. And every day they're putting up accurate information. in the Understanding War, the Petraeus group, they put up a map every day, shows you where the actual fighting is happening. As we know, in the last couple of weeks, there's been a dramatic escalation, starting with the blowing up of this bridge that went from Russia, mainland Russia, to Crimea. And as a result of that, we've seen the attacks on the infrastructure of the Ukraine by Russia. I've often been curious why Kiev was never bombed up until this time. One of the reasons I always thought was that downtown Kiev, there are a lot of religious shrines and things of that nature, and I thought because of the closeness with the Orthodox Church, but Putin now is bombing Ukraine and Kiev, going after the power. 30% of Ukraine has no power or water. And with winter approaching, I think that number is just going to get bigger. Who do you believe? Given all the experiences I had in Russia, and I've been to Ukraine maybe a dozen times, I find it hard to believe either one of them say, unless I know it to be true. Under communism, the truth didn't exist, as far as I can tell. And people often say, you know, how come those Russians in Ukraine don't smile? Well, the reason they didn't is if they were smiling or were sad, someone might tap them on the shoulder and say, what are you happy about? And there'd be an intrusion into their life, and they would try to protect it. And so, to give you an example, there's a main street in Moscow, and it's about 4 or 5 lanes. And one day I'm on this side, and I'm looking across the way, and there's a man I knew very well. And I saw him the next day. I said, Alexander, I saw you on Toskaya Street the other day. No, you didn't see me. I said, Alex, I know your jacket, I know your shoes, I know your paint. You didn't see me. And that was just common, to just deny everything, because that's a holdover from the Soviet days. So it's carried on in this war. I don't believe any of I see a reporter from CNN sitting in Kiev getting his information from the Ukrainian government. I don't believe him either. It's very hard to get accurate information. Corruption, I believe, it's always been the same. Under the Tsars, the communists, now whatever they have in Ukraine and Russia. The people at the top get most of the goodies, and on scales we can't even begin to understand. The average person does not. I'll give you an example. Before the war, in Moscow, the average wage was $1,100 a month. No housing costs, because most of them had their apartment from the Soviet days. The same wage in Ukraine was $400 a month. Ukraine was a much poorer country, and I think maybe their oligarchs stole much more proportionally than they did in Russia. But it's, and I'll get into more of it later, and I get outraged when I see a Russian oligarch on CNN opining about this war. There's a trail of bodies and broken dreams behind his wealth. I saw these men accumulated $10 billion inside of two years. That was not hard work. It was through terror mostly. And it was none of it was good, I would put it that way. So give me an example. Here's a Ukrainian oligarch who decides he should have a escalated down to the beach. Here is a Russian oligarch who this is Donald Trump's, one of his homes in Palm Beach that he bought for $25 million, turned around and sold it to a Russian oligarch for $95 million, called money laundering. Here is Putin's dacha. It is bigger than Buckingham Palace. Cost $1.3 billion to make. Here it sits on 170 acres over the Black Sea. The white oblong shape you see in the bottom is Alaport. The grass, rolling grass to the left of that, is actually the roof of a hockey rink. Putin is quite a hockey player, and he brings the Russian hockey players down to his rink to play hockey. This is Zelensky's Italian villa that you can rent for 50,000 euros a month. This is one of the Ukrainian oligarchs. That's his yacht. He financed Zelensky's career, then financed his campaigns. In 2011, he was part of a bank, this Igor was, and he stole $5 billion. And it's been investigated from 2011 to 2022. He took some of those billions to America and started buying properties all over the country. And our Justice Department has sued him for fraud. The Zelensky's parents, college professors, probably made $1,000, if they were lucky, $1,000 a month, just retired to a $5 million home in Israel. So the corruption among the people at the top is so pervasive. Ukraine has been trying to get into the European Union for 12 years. One of the requirements is they pass some anti-corruption legislation. They've never passed it. Now they're trying to say buffalo their way in because of the war. But even the Wall Street Journal, a conservative newspaper, said, what are we doing giving Ukraine, one of the most corrupt countries in the world, all this money and goods? In the past, they've taken some of the products, the Western military equipment the West has given them and sold it into to dictators in Africa and the Middle East. I've never seen Russian corruption has not changed. And I have seen nothing to tell me that Ukraine corruption has changed. They're both the same. They're both a product of the communist system. One is ranked 139 in the world, and the other one's ranked 133, something like that. But my personal experience, I could talk hours about what I saw as far as corruption goes, but I have one story that kind of says it all. So the last unit to leave Berlin to officially close World War II, that unit left Berlin by train, came to Moscow, and they marched down to Red Square where they had a huge ceremony. The leader of the group was a Russian general. His last act in leaving Berlin was to sell the telephone company for $125 million. And the check was made out to him and went into his Swiss bank account. So Putin at that time was a newly appointed prime minister, and he said, I'm going to cure corruption in Russia. So I said to myself, well, I'll watch what happens with this general to tell me what Putin is going to do. And he promoted him. And I said, well, that's all I need to know. But, you know, a picture's always worth 1,000 words. So here is pot just part, of $166 million in cash that was found in the home of the Minister of Corruption in Russia. And I guess we have to give Putin credit because he had him arrested. So we're seeing, this is what we're seeing every day, these tragic pictures. This is something both sides are doing as the armies move back and forth, and they take the people who were sympathetic to the Russian side and they'll tape them to a tree. Most of them, they'll pull their pants down and people go by and swat them. But both sides did it. It was not unique to one or the other. All of the buildings you see are really the old Soviet buildings. It's one of the reasons I say I've never seen any of the new modern buildings where the elites are living in Ukraine bombed. Both sides are looting, both sides are assassinations, and both sides have committed war crimes. People will ask, why aren't we pursuing on the war crime part? We withdrew from membership from the International Criminal Court because we were afraid they were going to turn it on us in Iraq. So here is the nuclear power plant. This is a good example of misinformation. The Russians seized this plant right in the beginning. And soon thereafter, you started hearing about the Russians of Ukraine was saying the Russians are bombing the plant. They want to cause a nuclear catastrophe to bring the Russians. And the Russians would say, no, we're not bombing the plant. Well, our people are in there. Why are we bombing it? And so they're going back and forth, for each accusing the other, until the UN nuclear team went in there. And they confirmed it was the Ukrainians who were bombing the plant, not the Russians. So this is just one. There's, I think, 3 or 4 different nuclear power plants in Ukraine, and they're all could be a huge disaster. There's a lot of blowing up now of ammo dumps inside of Russia by Ukrainian special forces. So the origin, how did all this happen? Back in 1990, when the Berlin Wall came down, James Baker, our Secretary of State, went to Gorbachev and he said, you let the wall come down and we'll promise never to put a country, a member of European NATO country on the border of Russia. So they made that agreement, down it came. Soon thereafter, the Baltic countries became members of NATO and they sit right on the border of Russia. And Putin and others said, see, you can't trust the West. The West rejoinder was, well, that didn't count because it wasn't in writing. Nevertheless, it counted to the Russians. And in 2014, the U.S. endorsed the Ukraine admission to NATO. Putin had been trying to get the West to talk, to discuss it. They wouldn't listen to him. So after this, he went in and seized the Crimea. Crimea was always historically part of Russia. Go way back 17th century. When the in 1954, Khrushchev gave administration of Crimea to the Ukrainian government. I had lunch in 1990 with Khrushchev's son, and I said, why did your father give Crimea to Ukraine? He said, no, he didn't give Crimea. He wanted them administered, the big difference. And nevertheless, that's what happened. But Putin took it. They had a vote down there. Most of them went to join Russia. What they don't tell you much is the number of Ukrainian soldiers who left the Ukrainian army and joined the Russian army in Crimea, basically because of pay. Ukraine is a much poorer country. So the sanctions, there were a few sanctions, but nothing happened. And that's been the origin of what was going on today. Eastern Ukraine, in what referred to generally as the Donbass area, that's ethnically Russian. The western part of Ukraine are mostly Polish, Germanic, not Slavs. So one of the reasons another reason Putin went in is that Ukraine had dammed up all the water going into Crimea, so the farms were particularly useless. One of the first places the army went to was to blow up the dams and the water. Then there were natural resources and to protect Russian ethnics. Impacts on Russia, we all read millions of people left both countries. Economy is downsizing rapidly. I talked to people in Moscow and they're telling me that every day they go looking for food. They had all been accustomed to Western food products. Those are disappearing. And inflation is growing very hard. There are no spare parts. Another example of the sanctions cutting the other way is when they put the sanctions down, it went down like a clamp. But there was, the number isn't true, but maybe 50 or 100 Western airliners had their planes sitting all over Russia. But those planes are owned by a company in Dublin. And they've been trying to get them back to no avail. So McDonald's, there are 900 McDonald's in Russia. They were closed, and a Russian bought them, reopened them, and they're not too concerned with copyright. They just took the golden arches and turned them sideways. Same with Starbucks, they did the same thing. There are major inflation, no more Western products. Many of them had homes in Spain they can't get to. Many of them had MasterCard Visa, can't use. And there's been very strange for Russia, but they're increasing their own gas and gasoline, which they're not used to. This is what I fear happening. This is what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed and there was this dramatic increase in inflation. It was left to the seniors who had, their pensions were wiped out by inflation. And they were left to go out onto the street with little trinkets from their homes to sell to get food. And I can see that happening again. Economically, the sanctions have not hurt the government because they're still selling $1 billion a day in gas and oil. And the war is costing them 400. Energy prices, inflation is going on across all over the world. Here's a short video explaining the importance of Russian oil.
Why is Russia's invasion of Ukraine so influential when it comes to the price of gas?
The world needs Russian oil and refined products. Russia produces somewhere between 9 and 10 million barrels a day of crude. They use about 4 of it for their own domestic needs. And Europe desperately needs Russian hydrocarbon molecules, whether it's crude oil, whether it's gasoline, diesel fuel heating oil, or particularly natural gas. They paid prices for natural gas this winter that were as much as 60 times what we pay in the United States. So if you lose that Russian oil, you could see prices really go up for a long period of time. We always thought that this would be a year where we saw high gas prices, but by high gas prices we meant maybe $4 a cup of coffee there or whatever, because we've lost some refining from last year, or from really pre-COVID, we've lost about 1.2 million barrels a day of refining. Enough to keep the market tight if you have a driving season where people are out there taking trips. Russian oil, it's part of the world market, and the world market has imports and exports. So every time you see a dollar increase in the price of crude, it translates to about 2.5 cents at the pump, whether you're in the United States or whether you're in the Mediterranean.
So there are a lot of other things what people don't realize is Russia, now that they control the Ukraine and parts of it, they control 30% of the wheat. And there's been a lot of problems after negotiations. Some of the Ukrainian wheat is being shipped out, but not enough. And Egypt depends 100% for their wheat from Ukraine. They're not going to have enough, so they're going to be food riots in Egypt and across Africa. Sunflower seeds, I mean, it goes neon gas, and we are still buying Russian products, oil, nickel, lithium, things like that. So this is a prediction of, and 71 million people have been driven into poverty because of this war. So the ramifications are all over the world. In Ukraine, 6 million people. Ukraine made a big, here's a good example of propaganda, they made a big splash about the Russian men being grabbed off the streets and in hiding and leaving the country. Well, the fact of the matter is, in February, Ukraine banned any man from leaving Ukraine because that's exactly what they did there too. Again, people with means got out. Ukraine is virtually broke. They're looking for $10 billion a month just to meet payroll of military and government workers. They want, counting, $800 billion, soon to be $1 trillion to rebuild. I just came back from London. They're petrified over there. The price of home heating gas is tripled, and they're afraid that it's going to keep skyrocketing. The government is asking pubs and restaurants to close at 8 o'clock to save on gas. And Gazprom, the Russian supplier of gas, is reducing the gas to Germany. The real question is, will Putin shut off gas everywhere? That's an example of all the countries in Europe depend on Russian gas. So a lot of these people in England and other places are going to have no heat. That's the big question, what's going to happen. So another byproduct, it's more spending. We don't spend enough. Now Congress is asking for more money because we're giving all this equipment to Ukraine. We're going to replace it, and there's no more arms control talks with Russia. And we're all on the verge of a recession. Nuclear war. Do I think there'll be a nuclear war? No, I don't think a major nuclear war. But I do think Putin is capable and would use tactical nuclear weapons. By that I mean to take out a city or something. My own position, as I mentioned in the beginning, it should be negotiated to end this craziness and the suffering for millions of people. Ukraine will never be the same. It'll take 25 or 40 or 50 years to rebuild it. Many Russians will never be the same either. And sanctions ultimately Russia cannot withstand them. Iran was cashiered. This is an example. President Trump pulled out of the Iranian deal, and now they're given payback by supplying Russia with drones. Elon Musk came up with a plan, which I think I would certainly agree with, negotiation to end it. But at the end of the day, going forward, this is what I think the world is going to look like. Russia, China, Pakistan, India, and Iran on one side, US, Europe, Australia, New Zealand. But you're going to have 6 billion people against 2 billion. Another theory that I can promote, or that I think, is that all of this war business is somewhat wagging the dog. We're standing up for democracy, we're standing up for all this kind of stuff just as a distraction. What's really going on is global warming. I'm going to give us some examples. For the first time in history, this is the New York Times, Russia was the dominant grower of wheat in the world. Why? Because every year, because of global warming, they're gaining millions of acres of land in Siberia. The growing season used to be June to September, now April to September. So that's where the wheat, all those soybeans that Iowa used to grow, Russia is growing them. And it's all being financed by China. And for the first time in history, there's a bridge between Russia and China, solely to transport the food product and mining product from Russia to China. But one of the oddities in that part of the world is this, Birubidza. There are 2 Jewish territories in the world, Israel and this one, Birubidza in Siberia. And it was set up by Stalin in 1954 as a home for Jewish people from the Soviet Union. When there were Jews who were allowed to emigrate to Israel, the population went from 55,000 down to 1,500, plus other Russians. Now, the population is regrowing because of the growth of the food industry. But in the town, they still have the menorah in front of the train station. The state university is Shalom Aleichem. And they have their own community center, just like you do. Here's another example of what no one's talking about in America, but Russia has joined with China in the Belt and Road Initiative. They're building roads and train network from China through Russia down to Europe to ship Russian products, Chinese products to Europe. China is also a big user of Russian gas. They have 3 pipelines, and they just this month signed for another one. Pakistan and India have said to Russia, if Europe won't buy your gas and oil, we'll buy it. So that's one of the reasons Putin has got the money he has. And here's probably the biggest surprise to everyone. This is where I call Putin competent in the Arctic Circle. Putin seized 425,000 square miles in the Arctic Circle, claiming that the Russian land under the water is, you don't stop the 200-mile limit until you get to the end of the Russian land. And he's building what many call a new ice curtain up there. What's at stake? All of the natural resources that are abundant in Russia and other parts of the world, oil, gas, diamonds, gold, all of them. He has military bases. This is a BBC reporter who got up into the newest air base in the Arctic Circle.
One of the soldiers just told us not to stray too far over in that direction, so we don't attract any polar bears. There's not a lot of comfort, of course, on board this Russian military cargo plane. plane, but this is the transport that's going to get us up into the Arctic and to Russia's northernmost military base there. This is definitely the most extreme airstrip that I've ever been to. The extraordinary thing about it is that any kind of plane can now land here, which is really important, of course, for the Russian military in terms of getting troops up here and supplies too. Well, they've brought out all the toys now. These are the Bastion anti-ship missiles, and this is a bit of a show of Russian might.
Период после Второй мировой войны, очень длительный период, считающий практически десятилетиями, 70-летиями. Таких сил здесь никогда не было. Несомненно, это так.
Up here on the top of the world, there is a vast expanse of ice and of emptiness. And yet Russia has made deploying its military up here to these extreme conditions a real priority. It's created this base here, the furthest north of all. It's a reminder that Russia has great ambitions for the Arctic and real interests here that it's determined to secure.
So this is an aerial view of how extensive the base is. They built military airfields up there, and really like an early warning missile site. They're drilling for oil as we speak. They just built a $27 billion LNG plant that's financed by China on the Arctic Ocean. They have this ship that is mapping the floor of the Arctic Ocean for raw materials. Putin has built the only two portable nuclear reactors in the world. This one powers all the oil drilling, and the other one powers a small town at the entrance to the Arctic Ocean. He has a fleet of 52 icebreakers. 2 are nuclear and 4 more under construction. That's the town being supplied the power. What he's after is opening the northern route so that all of the goods going from China, Japan, South Korea to Europe, Canada, America will go across the top of Russia and not through the Suez Canal, because it will be 30% quicker and almost 40% cheaper. And it'll have a devastating effect on Egypt. Last year, for the first time, they got ships through that in the winter. And here is a short, this is about a minute, but it shows you how quickly the ice is breaking up in the Arctic Ocean.
ледопроходимость. И один элемент, позволяющий нам еще лучше иметь ледопроходимость, это корпус, покрыт нержавеющей сталью. Я напомню, скажу, с 93-го года на Ямале, вот, в 90-е, в начале 2000-х это было гораздо серьезнее, сложнее, толще, многолетнего. Сейчас практически мы не встречаем такого.
Of course, there are problems melting from permafrost. Any buildings built on that are collapsing. Pipelines have collapsed, it's releasing toxic pollutants, even some anthrax. Those are all major issues. There's a building that's collapsed. But it's the same in Alaska. We have the same problem.
Very briefly, the
So
followers
here's
of Russia
Joe
in
Hill.
1999, you had this meteoric
She wrote a
rise, a
book
very
about
quick
Putin.
move into the upper echelons of power. At a time when there was a lot of soul searching in Russia about the restoration of the state, and that was really our starting point. He came in at the very end of a really tumultuous first decade of an independent Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, in which a lot of things happened. The country was just literally turned on its head and was trying to find a new path forward. And that was really our starting point. The first identity that we basically gave Mr. Putin is one of the statists. In Russian it's the Gosударственник. And it's really all about the restoration of the state. And we explain in the book a very important fact for people looking at Russia from the outside, and we should point out too that this book is not written for Russians. It's written for people trying to understand not just how Mr. Putin fits in to the Russia of today, but how the Russian system works, so that we can hopefully have better policy, or at least a better understanding of how to deal with Russia. And the state in Russia is a very important element of this. It's a metaphysical entity. It's not the state as we think about in America, where it's there for the nurturing of the individuals. The American dream is all about the individual and individual's success. In Russia, the state is a thing in itself, and it's the ultimate entity. It's the be-all and the end-all of Russia. It's the state that has to be preserved. It's the state that has to be served. And Mr. Putin, being a Gosударственник in Russia's statist, is someone who is appointed, even self-appointed, to serve the state, and that's all that they do. It's not about individualism. And that was the first identity that we came up with. And Mr. Putin himself, in 1999, at the very end of that year, the very end of December 29th, before he then becomes the Russian president in 2000, talks about how he sees his mission, his role, as restoring the greatness of the Russian state.
Right, at that point he had, as you said, he was prime minister in 1999, and Boris Yeltsin resigned before the actual end of his constitutional term and handed over the presidency to Yeltsin as acting president. So at the end of 1999, as the new millennium starts, Putin knows that he's going to be president of Russia, and he issues a message to the Russian population. It was actually issued online, so it's rather modern, I guess, for the time. It's become known as this millennium message, in which he outlined really his goals for Russia. I think what's really remarkable about that statement, and the kind of thing that permeates our book, is to try to show the consistency of this man's views and his stated intentions. We won't by any means say that you can trust everything he says, but I think to a remarkable degree, he says what he means and he fulfills what he says, at least in the important things. And if you go back today, which we do in the book, we go back to that document repeatedly, this one from late 1999, the new year, the new millennium, and show that what's happened since is very consistent with what he said he wanted to do.
So I was giving these talks, and about a month ago, some woman saw it, and she said, "Can you give us something on a lighter note? It's all pretty grim." And I said, "Sure." So I was there when they made the movie Rush House, 1990. Michelle Pfeiffer and Sean Connery. Through a serendipity, if nothing else, I ended up having lunch in New York City with a friend of mine, and he brought a friend of his who happened to be the husband of Michelle Pfeiffer's agent. And he tells the story when Michelle finished making the movie, she stopped in New York to have dinner with him and his wife. And so he said at dinner, I said to Michelle, "How did you like making a movie in Moscow?" She said, "Oh, I loved it. Great people. I saw some things I never saw before. I just thought it was wonderful." So, okay, so what was the hardest part of making a movie in Moscow? She said, "That's the easy one. That was keeping Sean Connery out of my bedroom." And so that's my email, and I'll be happy to take any questions you have.
I have a question about the Russian Orthodox churches in the United States and elsewhere. Are they as supportive of Putin?
I don't know, to be honest with you. I know the Russian Orthodox Church split with the Ukrainian Church. They used to be together because of the war, obviously. I don't know about the Russian Orthodox Church here.
What do you think the Putin now today has said that he's going to impose?
Martial law.
Yes, thank you.
I think it's because they expect a big attack from the Ukrainians, and maybe to keep people off the street. And anyone on the street is liable to be a Ukrainian because it's hard enough to tell who's who. Maybe that, but also he has said he is open to negotiation. And I think a lot of what he's doing in terms of bombing the heat and power is to drive negotiation, because it's going to be miserable for people in Ukraine, in Europe who have lost, and it could eventually cause NATO to split. Germany, some people in Germany, why should we freeze? And a lot of them, unfortunately, are looking to America, who we appear to be fighting a third-party war. And, you know, I don't think Biden or any president will go and say, we've got to give Ukraine $10 billion a month and all the rest of it. I mean, there comes a point of no return. But more importantly, I think that we're really taking our eye off the ball. Ian Bremmer, who is the leading risk assessment company in the world, and he has offices in 13 countries, grew up in Chelsea. And he says, you know, what we're really facing is, and no one's paying attention, in the year 2050, the middle of the world is going to be uninhabitable. And there's going to be 140 million people looking for a new home. If we think that we have a problem at the border now, what are we going to do then? And there are only two countries that can absorb those numbers, Russia and Ukraine. I mean, Russia and Canada. And that's really what, in his opinion, you know, we should be, but we don't tend to look too forward in this country. It's everything short term. Next election, next quarter for business, things like that. So we have a lot of major problems. Global warming, we have half of our Congress thinks it's a joke. Yet we have 14 cities that are liable to be underwater unless we start doing something.
Thank you.
The nuclear power plant, you said it was the Ukrainians that were bombing it. Who owns the power plant? First of all, is that Russia or Ukraine?
The nuclear plant?
Right.
It's Ukrainian.
Yeah.
And Russia seized it.
But why are the Ukrainians
They want
bombing the Russians out?
No, they Russians out or cause a nuclear leak that they could blame on Russia.
That's all we need to say, but Chernobyl.
It's a lot of sobering thoughts. Meanwhile, we're facing it, inflation, we're going into a recession, gas is going to go up again, heating oil this winter is going up. I find it hard for anyone to tell me why we shouldn't negotiate. I mean, we have some people in the Pentagon who think this is great, there's no doubt about that. But they're not it's freezing, they're not living in Ukraine, scraping for food. You know, it's easy to say those things here. You have comfort, you have food, heat.
You know how many times that they've talked about negotiations over there between Russia, said fine, you know, and Ukraine said fine. But Putin lies. You know, he says he's going to do this as far as negotiations, but it all ends up falling through. Because
right. I mean, again, I repeat, they all lie. But I think that I would like to see America be. I saw a segment on 60 Minutes about the war, but I was waiting for them at the end of it. We should have peace. These people shouldn't have to live like this.
No.
And it seems to me that America and China could get together and force peace.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it could go on for, you know, well, in my lifetime, Vietnam, 20 years, was it worth it?
Mm.
Iraq, worth it? Afghanistan, worth it? Millions of people dead, Americans, my contemporaries, your contemporaries. So.
Could you tell me a little bit about your background, what you did? Could you tell me a little bit about your background?
Publishing.
You're a publisher.
Yeah, and I still am. And I give classes on how to write, self-publish your stories. I just did a book with a man, I've done 3 actually, with late 80s and 90-year-old men. But this man was 88 years old. He formed the first successful software company in the country and the first high-tech company to make $1 billion. So he wrote his book, and what was nice about it, at the end of it, he said to me, I can die now. I said what I wanted to say. And everything was positive, because that's not always the case. I always believe if you're going to write a book, should be positive. Having said that, one woman stood up and said to me, I don't agree with you. I said, well, that's obviously, you don't have to do everything I say, but she said, I wrote in my book, the only time I want to hear about my in-laws is the date their obituary appears in the paper. And I said, you know, that says more about you than them. And that's, so.
Where do you have your publishing? Where do you have your publishing company?
I'm in Merrimack, New Hampshire, and Mariposa down in Massachusetts.
Okay.
I've been doing it all my life, and I still do it. It's a great, it's a world of ideas.
Yeah.
I've done now 2 books with my granddaughters, different granddaughters. So there's great ways of collaboration, things like that. So, thank you all.
Thank you.